As everyone starts to make their way back to their chairs, we'd like to thank another one of our title sponsors, the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors. They've been gracious enough to support this event, and we'd like to share with you a video from them. Thank you all very much.
In the heart of Southern California lies a community where the spirit of giving and advocacy shapes the very fabric of life. From the Gaviota Coast to the Ventura County line, we are the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors. Meet the Realtors of the South Coast, professionals dedicated not just to finding homes, but to building communities.
My name is David Kim. As a realtor, I'm also a member of this community. You know, I raised my family here. I've been living here for 25 years.
Hi, my name is Karina Maddock. I'm a realtor. I think a realtor is a very important part of the community because we get to help people in one of those pivotal moments of their lives. As a realtor, you're not only part of a transaction, but you're part of a community.
So one of the things that I feel very fortunate about is doing real estate in Santa Barbara. I mean, Santa Barbara is a pretty small town. I think it's great that I'm friends with agents and brokers from all the different companies. We talk about things that are important to the community. Again, things that we can call our friends and clients and family members about.
So nothing better than the realtor to be part of different moving parts of the city to make sure that we all contribute to make the city exactly what we say that it is, the best place to live.
Our lifestyle speaks for itself. From tract homes and downtown condos to hillside properties and luxury estates, our region has everything to offer. At its core, the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors is committed to advocating for our city and shaping policies for a better tomorrow.
My name is Stacy Kaplan and I am a realtor. I'm a second-generation realtor. I am very invested in our beautiful community of Santa Barbara. The Santa Barbara Association of Realtors works directly with our city officials, usually ahead of when something is published, to try and assist crafting language with ordinances and to try to avoid unforeseen consequences. Our outreach is ongoing. It's continuous. We are building relationships, building trust. We are looking to be part of the solution, and we can only do that through continued dialogue.
The Santa Barbara Association of Realtors knows no bounds when it comes to giving back to our beautiful community.
I'm Kelly Knight and I'm a realtor. When I was a young attorney, it was really stressed that it's our fundamental responsibility as people that work in this beautiful community to give back to it in some way.
I think it came to me early on when I was involved in the association because I always saw that the association was constantly giving back to the community. What's really important for everyone to know is that I was just amazed. There's just been so much nonprofit support.
We're so fortunate because our association is very involved in the community. Because of that, I think a lot of the realtors that work here also have a passion for serving the community.
We're not only here to build communities, but to keep them strong. That's why over the past 11 years, we've raised over $460,000 supporting local organizations and charities. Additionally, our association received $1,150,000 from the Realtors Relief Foundation to assist victims of the Thomas Fire, debris flows, and the January 2023 flooding with mortgage or rental payments so they can rebuild their lives and homes without worrying about the financial burdens of natural disasters. Realtors are community members just like you. They live here, learn here, and raise their families here. That's why we care. We get to call the South Coast home, too.
All right, I think we're on. Everybody can hear me? No? Now can you hear me? Great, okay. I'm Olivia Marr. I'm a local land use and real estate attorney in town. And today we are joined by some wonderful panelists, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. We have Shane
thankfully agreed to join us because one of our panelists got sick, unfortunately, and wasn't able to be here. That was at the legislature. So if you could each briefly introduce yourselves, and then we'll have a fun conversation about housing law and implementation.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Timmy Tway. I am the Director of Community Development for the City of San Luis Obispo, so just right up the road. I grew up on the Central Coast and really honored to be serving the City of San Luis Obispo. We are a pro-housing designated city with a really supportive city council and community that has prioritized housing production over the last few financial cycles. And so I'm happy to talk more about what we're doing in the City of San Luis Obispo. My professional background and my heart is in planning, and so I'm a planner at heart, and really enjoying my time at the City of SLO.
Hi everyone, I'm Lisa Krause. Can everyone hear me in the back? Oh good, okay. I'm with HCD, and I'm in their Housing Accountability Unit, also called HAU, and I'm on the Surplus Land Act team. There's 5 teams under the HAU, and that's one of them. And I'm happy to be here. I've been a planner for 15 years. Some of that was spent on the Central Coast, Atascadero, Ventura. And I've been with HCD now for 2.5 years. So I'm excited to be here.
Hi everyone, Shane Phillips. I feel like I've introduced myself sufficiently.
So Lisa, can you explain, in 2017 there was obviously the big housing bill package, and since then a lot of activity at the legislature, and one of the things they did was empower HCD with enforcement over those bills and laws. Can you explain briefly for the group what the Housing Accountability Unit does and why you think it's so important, what its focuses are, those types of things generally?
Yeah, certainly. So in the Housing Accountability Unit, it was formed basically around 2021 with the budget, which grew HCD's Housing Accountability Unit. There's a lot of need for technical assistance, so help in basically implementing some of those new laws, and that's what the unit really does. First and foremost is to help jurisdictions, cities, counties, basically stay in compliance. How many of you work with cities or with the city or county? Okay, a good handful of you. How many of you are advocates? Okay, equally, great. Yeah, so that's kind of our bread and butter. We start there. It's extremely important, the work we do, and we have collaborative, a lot of collaboration between cities, counties, advocates, and we keep each other accountable. So we get those units built, and yeah, that's why we're here.
And there's lots of different laws. I know that we focus a lot on like the housing element laws and locally, but when I looked at the list of things that the HCD and the HAU do, it's like you said, you're in the Surplus Lands Act, or there's how many different departments?
So there's many departments under the HAU. We're like considered the sticks. We have a planning grants and incentives section, which they got the carrots. I'm in the stick side, and
you get to be the bad guy.
Yes, I get to be the bad guy. But yeah, it's all about accountability, and that's important. The housing element laws, there's a part of that which is in the under the HAU, just making sure those jurisdictions, they're kept accountable, they're progressing with their numbers. We also have just the other side of housing elements, which is just the review portion. So it's divided up in teams. Let's see, I think, did that answer that? Yeah. Okay.
I feel like worth mentioning that prior to 2021 or so, or like this most recent cycle of housing elements, there was essentially no accountability whatsoever. There were very few, penalties for I mean, you couldn't even really not have a compliant housing element, whereas now they're actually reviewed thoroughly, and if you're not compliant, there are consequences, and like that's just a totally new world in many ways, despite us having had housing elements since the 70s or 80s.
Exactly.
Right, it's no longer a paper exercise.
Yeah, yeah. And Timmy, in the city of San Luis Obispo, my understanding is you are a little bit ahead of us in terms of where our jurisdictions are in their housing element process. We just completed locally rezones, and now I guess are heading into implementing policy in that aspect. And so can you maybe step us through sort of where you are in the city of SLO, what it's been like through this last housing element process?
So our housing element spans 2020 to 2028, so we are pretty much exactly halfway through. In terms of, I wasn't in San Luis Obispo when they got the certification for the 2020 housing element, but I think it was kind of the beginning of this ramping up of knowing that the state was really going to take housing elements seriously. So it was a really, really big push from the city to meet the requirements of the state, to work with the state. It's an iterative process, right, of continually talking to the state about what about this, and how about this policy, is this good enough, or can we go further than that? And I think we've been very successful with our implementation. We have produced our RHNA requirements, so our Regional Housing Needs Assessment requirements is 3,500 units during that 8-year period. We have produced 2,500 so far at the 4-year mark. I think not a surprise to anyone in the room, a majority of those are above moderate, so we are doing great with our market rate housing, as you could suspect, and we're really trying to push for the below market rate housing and working closely with our development community. We have a few thousand housing units in the pipeline. Obviously, the financial situation has affected whether or not some of those units will come to fruition, but we're working closely to try to see what we can do as the city to facilitate the building of those units. And in terms of our policies and programs, we're pretty far. We pushed really hard at the beginning of the housing element cycle to get a lot of the work done. And the city also, I alluded to this a little bit in my introduction, but the city council has made housing and homelessness a major city goal for the last kind of 5 to 7 years, and we take the major city goals pretty seriously. They direct all of the work program items that each department does, and so everything we do ties back to that major city goal. And one of the things we did in San Luis Obispo is we have a dedicated housing team within the planning division that's there to both work on implementation of the housing element and then work with developers to figure out, how do we move projects along, where are there barriers. Housing element cycles go fast, so we'll be thinking about the next one pretty soon, but in terms of this cycle, I think we're doing pretty well. Having said that, I still know Lisa outside of this from, we're sitting next to each other, we like each other, but from compliance. So, we're a pro-housing city, but we still hear from HCD with people, if developers are having a problem and they reach out to HCD for compliance help, we hear about it. We try to, all come together and work through issues. So even though we're making progress, we're still kind of figuring out how the state law changes work and how we can do better,
So what, like Timmy's talking about the implementation of the housing element, how would the HAU get involved in that? Are they giving you progress reports? Is there sort of a back and forth? How are you? I understand the metrics of RHNA, right? Like there's an amount of housing that you're supposed to zone for and have available. You either did that or you didn't. You either rezoned or you didn't. But now when we go into the implementing the policy phase, how is the HAU monitoring that and keeping up on that piece?
So every year the cities, counties, they report their APR numbers, so the number of units that they've built in the low, moderates, whatnot. So we can kind of see, and we're a very data-driven department, we can kind of see where you're meeting your numbers. And we also, for those of you who work for cities and counties, you're probably familiar with your housing element reviewer. You know their name. They may reach out to you. Hopefully not. Hopefully you're being proactive on your end. if there are any questions or issues before HCD reaches out to you to either see, have you done the rezone that was part of the housing element approval and compliance, or has it been stalled? Those are things that maybe HCD will reach out about, like, are you meeting your goals and your milestones? So,
and if there's, a developer or somebody in the audience that is concerned about whether their jurisdiction is doing the right thing, going fast enough, those types of things, are you a resource for third parties as well?
Oh, definitely. We need that as far as accountability goes throughout the state. We need the eyes and ears on the ground to help us all stay accountable. And that includes, developers, advocates. If the cities or counties aren't meeting those milestones, we do hear about it. We are collaborative. We understand sometimes resources are constrained, but communication is key. That's one of those universal things, is staying in communication, staying in compliance, and that's really what we're geared to do first and foremost, is helping agencies stay in compliance, because we all benefit when we're all in it to get housing. So.
And I know of it because I'm an attorney, and I hear people say, let's ask HCD, it's a new thing, right? Ask for technical assistance or ask them a question. And Timmy, what's your sort of thoughts on that experience? Because you're sitting there in the city, and and this is kind of happening maybe without you. Do you find it a beneficial process for you, or what's been your experience with that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think, I actually didn't know that the Housing Accountability Unit is so new. I've been in planning, I think, a similar amount of time as you, and so I think there's this shift happening in the planning profession that's really interesting, where, a lot of people got into the profession and this didn't exist. And so I think there's maybe a natural inclination to feel like it's a combative relationship, or like the state's going to come after us, or we better watch out, or we don't want to hear from HCD, that's a bad thing. And one of the things I'm working on, with my staff is being more proactive and seeing HCD as a resource. But it can be hard because housing elements are so difficult. I was at the state APA conference, and someone asked a question, you describe one word to use to describe your housing element process. And I don't know that there were many positive words from the planners about how fun that experience was. But I think I think the idea of a resource, there's a portal online, and you can go to the portal, a developer can go to the portal, a homeowner, I could go to the portal and say, hey, I'm having this issue, or how do you define, front yard setback, or how do you define detached? Just things. I think one of the challenges is, and you may all feel this if depending on how closely you're involved with development, is these state laws, while I think very well intended, sometimes it's not one size fits all. And we just get the funkiest requests, and then we have to think about the definition and the legislative intent. And I'm working on a more proactive relationship and helping staff understand it's not bad to ask, what did you mean by this, or how is the state interpreting this? One of the challenges, to be honest, is some developers in the community will get a response from staff on something and then go to the portal and ask say the city denied this thing for this reason, what do you think? And the state works with them, and we don't know that the developer does that. If you're a developer, tell your city, that would be so helpful, because we want to, for the most part, at least in our city, we want to do the right thing. We want to make sure we're complying with the law. But sometimes it feels like maybe the state doesn't have all of the information, or there's a little more that is more to the story that may impact the answer they get. And I've had a situation, I think Lisa knows this, we talked about this, but I have a situation where someone went to the state, they said the city denied my permit for whatever it was, and they told their story, and the state said that's illegal, they can't do that. And then the developer attached that letter, sent it to the mayor, and said, your staff's not complying with state law. And that's never a good place for us to be. I had no idea what this was even about because we aren't looped into the conversation. So I think there's some work to be done maybe between cities and the state of figuring out how do we make it more collaborative so everyone's coming to the table and able to, we want to do the right thing. So I think there's room for improvement there, but I do love that there is a resource where if we do have a question, we can go ask for help. Because they are very confusing laws that people interpret a million different ways for every single parcel you have in your city. So, yeah.
I'd like to add to that. I agree. I specialize in one aspect. I specialize in the Surplus Land Act, and in our unit there's 47 analysts. I'm one of them, and there's 5 teams. I'm on one of the teams. I may work within other areas, but it is difficult, and we do recognize that there's a lot of laws, and they keep changing, they keep fine-tuning them, and that's probably why we put a lot of emphasis on technical assistance and being proactive. But to your point, to me, when we do receive like a question, maybe it could be in the form of a complaint from a developer. Our goal really is to get both sides, both perspectives before. Now, we may have provided like a technical assistance letter or an email saying, well, this is what the law says, cut and paste, very quick. But if there is like a serious complaint, or maybe there's a stalled project, we may very well look into it, but we will reach out to the city before closing that line of communication, because we do definitely need both sides of a story.
And are there, I would assume you get a lot of questions. Are there, just for the group, are there areas that are better left to talking to your local city than talking to HCD? Are there certain things that HCD receives, or HAU receives as questions that are better left, or areas that you think you can be helpful in more than others, and if people are thinking about reaching out to the HAU or HCD?
Well, just personally, it is helpful if before reaching out, you've done a little bit of homework. That's helpful because we do get a lot of requests. And sometimes in some teams, like ADU is very busy. They get a ton of questions. There is an ADU guidelines. There's a lot of information to help understand the laws. The accountability and enforcement team, they're swamped with questions. So trying to, I guess, do the research before asking the question would be helpful. Also, so resource-wise, we have a bunch of technical assistance letters is what we call them, and we may have already opined on an issue. So if you were to reach out to one of our portals, like the accountability portal, we may just send you a link to the letter. Like, you have a density bonus law issue that's come up, we may have a letter about it. So it's quite possible that that's the answer that you'll get. So maybe do a little bit of background research. You may find that your answer is just right there, but we take all questions. It's just what that prioritization may be is a little bit different. It's all on a case by case.
Okay, Shane, I'm going to kind of flip it a little bit into a broader conversation. So in your keynote, you spoke of your 3 S's: supply, stability, and subsidy. I think most of what we've been talking about is with the housing element law, which I think is geared towards supply, but maybe a little bit others. Do you think the legislature is adequately addressing all 3 of your S's, or are they falling short in certain categories?
I mean, I think they're falling short in all categories, but I don't even really mean that as a critique. I think that's just, it's very hard to do everything you need to do. They've done a lot on supply, but also you look at statewide housing production and it has not budged. It's shifted a little bit more toward ADUs, which might actually be a bad thing, all things considered, because the data I've seen shows that somewhere between half and 2/3 of ADUs are actually like long-term occupied. And so a unit built as an ADU might not serve quite the same purpose as like a condo unit, multifamily, or even a single family home. So clearly there's more to do there because it just hasn't taken yet. And I think there's a need to learn some lessons from what has made the ADU laws so successful, reducing fees, making things ministerial by right rather than discretionary approvals, setting deadlines on when those approvals have to be issued, all those kinds of things that have occurred. Very clear rules that cities can just kind of default to without having to adopt their own ordinances, I think is also helpful. We've just, for understandable reasons, we've basically made it so that there was SB 827 in 2017, which would have upzoned big parts of the state very significantly between 4 and 8 stories near transit. And that would have just been like automatically done by the state. And that failed. The one after the next year also failed. And so we kind of went to this, well, now everyone's just going to do it themselves. And that's what cities said they wanted. But of course, now they actually have to do the thing, and they're not all that happy about it. Yeah. Which, I think you sort of have to go through that process where you got to give cities enough rope to hang themselves. You can't just immediately change the zoning statewide. I mean, I would like that to have happened, honestly. But if we were to do that, there would be this feeling of the state has overstepped its authority. They didn't even give us a chance. And some cities, I think, are doing a good job, but many still are resisting, or they're doing the bare minimum, and it's just not going to make a big difference. On stability and subsidy, I think we've done a decent job on stability. We passed AB 1482, which is the anti-rent gouging, kind of a very weak form of rent stabilization, but that's helpful for kind of the worst cases where someone, a landlord passes away or sells the property, and then a new one comes in and jacks up the rent by like 100% because someone was getting a pretty good deal. And that's effectively an eviction. So that kind of thing is sort of, in many cases, illegal now. And then we have just cause eviction protections, which I think are also a good thing. There's more that could be done there. I voted against Prop 33, which would have repealed the Costa-Hawkins Act, which places limits on statewide or the rent control policies cities can adopt. But I do think Costa-Hawkins should be reformed. In Los Angeles, we have a rent stabilization ordinance that, because of Costa-Hawkins, it applies only to multifamily built before 1979, and we can never change that, ever. It could be the year 2100, it would still be limited to 1979 if we don't change that law. So I think there's things there. On subsidies, more can always be done, but we have spent a lot. It's just we haven't done those other things, and so every dollar we spend is just buying us less every year.
Yeah. Can I speak to something that?
Of course.
There's cities that are trying, right, and then some that are maybe resisting the change. And
Newport.
I agree that the ADU law, I agree that the ADU law is effective because it's one of the more clear, like you can do this, you can't do that, right? And everyone must do X, Y, Z. And I think just to speak to some of the challenge, I'm in a city, like so much political support, a lot of community support for housing. I mean, it really is amazing kind of how people have come around to accepting that there's an issue and wanting to do something about it. But you brought up, the fees, reduced or no fees for ADUs, and some of those other things. And I'll say one of the challenges that we face is the infrastructure. And so I have extensive conversations with developers about, we're pro-housing, but that doesn't mean housing at any cost. We have to be able to create the infrastructure that we need to support all of this housing. And then in terms of keeping up with the state laws, again, I love when the state law is very clear. And in the cases where it's not, or where we have to change things, I mean, even a city where we've put a lot of money into the planning program, I mean, we just don't have the resources to address all of the changes that are constantly happening. So it feels like we're trying to catch up, and we're spending a lot of time redoing our ordinances, and then also trying to facilitate the housing development, and so then that falls behind. And so, you know, I just think cities, I don't know what the answer is. A lot of it feels almost impossible because we're always trying to catch up, where we want to do the thing, but the resources just are very scarce to be able to facilitate. And we've utilized like REAP grants and LEAP grants, and that's been great, but it, you know, even in a place where there's not a lot of barriers, it's still very, very hard to just keep up to date with these things, and also provide the parks and the streets and the sewer lines and things. And so it's a long-term, dare I say, planning. You got to plan. You have to plan for it, and it takes a while, and things are expensive. So
this is one area where I feel like, again, you know, doing what we've done with ADUs to some extent, but scaling that up to larger projects, not talking like a 300-unit apartment building, but like 10 units, 15 units, that kind of scale and lower, having these things be by right, essentially just go straight to the permitting department rather than having to go through planning. Because I think, you know, my understanding of the people I know who work in planning departments is like development services, permit counter, or entitlements is like the job no one wants. Planners want to plan, not just like process applications. And so the more we can have those applications just be objective, you know, ministerial, not having, you know, difficult decisions that have to be made, which like even that is still challenging, especially when the guidance is not very clear. But I think that's the right direction to be headed. And I think I'm not a city planner, but I just get the impression, if I were a city planner, I'll just put it that way, I would want more decisions to be by right so I could do other things, because I think most things planners do is more interesting to them than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't
And
work
more important.
I don't work in a planning department, but I would assume keeping up with or trying to track all the laws, all the changes, making sure that you're compliant with them all the time would be, you know, not only time consuming but frustrating. So in a city, you're pro-housing, and we can talk about the pro-housing designation in a little bit, but do you ever think, do you have the political will, or have you ever thought, well, I can go above and beyond what the state legislation is. We could make a determination in our city to make things by right, and perhaps make our local laws so ministerial easy, right, that you wouldn't have to spend too much time worrying about whether you're hitting the state's mark because you knew you were beyond it. Do you guys try?
And I think SLO did that. So what's funny is, you know, I think they did before, and now the state laws have caught up in some of the areas where they were more progressive, and now we're like just standard. But yes, we think about that all the time, and but it's the resources of we gotta overhaul this whole thing. You know, the zoning codes have been around for 100 years, and they've been like piecemeal put together, and some of it doesn't make sense, and you really need the time and the like energy to just sit and kind of pull it apart and put it back together. And I think it's important to recognize reality too, which is that this is a paradigm shift from the way planning has worked for a very long time, especially in communities where people care about the character of the community. And so, you know, it's kind of easy for us to sit up there and say it should all be by right and forget parking requirements and all of those things, but that's a politically hard sell, right? So unless the state says you have to forget parking for these things, one, it takes political will to be a council member or a board member that says, you know what, we're going to go above and beyond, because there are people that like the way things are. And we also still have this tension where we have policies that say retain as much local control as possible. And, you know, and so we are constantly, it's the balance of how are we retaining local control where appropriate, and what does that even mean in this new era of, you know, 2017 and beyond as a planner, you know, as a community member, as a city council member. So we're still figuring out, you know, what that looks like with these new laws and this kind of new world that we're in.
There is a very real, like, political challenge at the local level where, on the one hand, I want to say, like, you know, especially as a council member, your job isn't to get reelected, right? It's to do good things for the city. On the other hand, like if you're just going to be recalled immediately after approving this or that policy, and the policy is going to be undone by whoever replaces you, then you haven't actually accomplished anything. And so my observation is that state officials who pass these laws, which are, you know, in most cases much more aggressive, ambitious than what any city is doing, or almost any city is doing, they're not punished for it, whereas city council members actually often are, and mayors and so forth. You know, I always like to point to the main architect of Oregon's laws, both stability, rent stabilization kind of stuff, and supply. They were kind of ahead of us even on a lot of these things. She's now the governor. And here in California, where if there is a housing legislator, it's Scott Wiener up in San Francisco. He just won re-election in the primary with like 70% of the vote. And a lot of people really dislike him because of his positions on housing, but like apparently the voters actually are behind this, or it's just not salient to voters, these housing bills, for the assembly members and senators they elect. And so I think there's just a natural reason to go in that direction, because it's hard, if not in many places impossible, I think, for city officials to go beyond a certain point.
Yeah.
And the kind of level they're able to get to is far short of what we need.
So you spoke in your keynote about, like, I think you called it an informational campaign or
Informational intervention.
Intervention,
yeah.
And
the most like formal academic way of talking to people, yeah.
But I often think that, you know, I mean, everybody locally kind of learned about the housing element and everything when it became when it was in the news with the rezones and what have you. And I always think the state is passing, you know, tons of legislation to push housing, but could they be doing more, or should we be doing more locally to educate people, right? To like give them the information as to why this is so important. Other than, you know, if you're in the city of Los Angeles and you see, you know, encampments or things like observations that you're seeing visually, but is there more that the state could be doing to educate the citizens of California about why we need to do this and why they need to support their local governments in the production of housing? Or
I have thoughts, but I'll just say them quickly. I don't think the state is going to do a good job of that. I don't think people hear or will listen to state officials for the most part. I think that has to be a local thing. I do think the state, in the same way as they can provide technical assistance, they can help provide the tools, including communication tools and ways of talking about these things that local officials and department staff and even just local advocates and others can use or adapt and then bring that. But you have to, it's never convincing to have some, I mean, even me, like I'm not going to convince certain people because you don't know me and you don't necessarily trust me for that reason. But if I convince someone that you know and then they tell that same message to you, it might actually get through and you might change your mind. And so I think you have to go through those steps.
I mean, we spoke before and we were talking about how important narrative is, and your controlling of the conversation. And I feel like with the housing laws and just, you know, living in our community, you know, a lot of the time there's a feeling of it's them versus me, right? We talked about League of Cities earlier, that type of thing, this approach where cities, you know, are trying to protect their own and the state's the bad guy that's forcing us. So why did we change the law? Because the state made us do it. And similarly, you know, like, why are we doing it? Because the Housing Accountability Unit's going to come after us. And how do we, so you were great to talk earlier when we spoke about how you're trying to control that narrative in your community a little bit more.
I totally agree with you, Shane. I mean, I will always ask the state for help. There's millions, we need money, we need guidance, we need guides. But I think the education really has to be at the local level because, you know, especially in kind of the housing unfriendly jurisdictions, it's going to feel like more of the same. Like they're telling us this thing, they don't really know what's going on here, they don't know this community. And we've done, I think the narrative is incredibly important, and we've done a lot. One of the things we're proactively trying to do in San Luis Obispo is We now are framing almost all of our housing conversations as a continuum of housing. And this came about because we realized we were doing so well with our above moderate rate housing, because that's kind of the low hanging fruit and that's the easy stuff. And we also have an incredibly serious problem with unhoused community members. Like it's a big deal in San Luis Obispo, and a lot of our resources are going to trying to get people into housing. And so we realized, we have to think about it as they're all connected. We have our unhoused community members, we have transitional housing, supportive housing, shelters, and it moves through this, what we call a continuum, and we have this visual that we use whenever we talk about housing. Then we have our deed restricted rental, our deed restricted home ownership, our rentals, our market rate, and the importance of it's an ecosystem. And unless we can produce units at each of these kind of parts of the ecosystem, people get stuck, or we keep producing at the higher end and we will not solve or even make a dent in our issues with those that are unhoused. So we have to provide the pipeline to help people move up through this ecosystem of housing. So we're really trying to shape that narrative, and I think, the homelessness issue is so serious and really severe, but has made the issue really visible. And so, I think one of the questions you had asked me earlier was, where did the political will come from in SLO? And I think part of it is this is a visible issue now, and it's affecting a lot of people. And so it's just telling that story of, and then I think even in areas that I have been in that are less kind of friendly to new development, it's finding what resonates with the local community. And it's my kids can't live here, our workers can't live here, and that's everywhere, right? And so it's just understanding what is going to resonate with the local community. And I will admit, sometimes it's nice to be able to say, with density bonus, I tell developers, you'll have protection if you use density bonus, and so sometimes we use that to our advantage of the state made this thing, and if you can figure out how to make a density bonus project, it protects you from some of the discretion that we would have otherwise, right? And so we also use that to our advantage of, not like a stick that is protecting them from the city, really. Mm-hmm. So,
I mean, I've heard from legislators and staffers and others that they will hear from council members I have to oppose this and attack this bill publicly, but thank you for taking it off my plate so I don't have to keep taking hard votes and making this decision that is just not supported in my community, but I know is the right thing to do.
Yeah, it's trying to figure out how in the next 10 years that's not always the dynamic, right? So it sounds like in your community, at least there's some that can be actively pro-housing and they get the support, and that's the push and pull. So speaking of communities that are not compliant, do you have any examples or of sort of non-city of San Luis Obispo type cities, things that are still struggling with at the basic level? The worst offenders?
Maybe without naming names.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, I would be fine
I don't know if I'll name names, but you could go on our website. I would say generally, most cities and counties are complying, and that's great to see because we can't do this without everyone's help. That said, there are a handful, and unfortunately we have entered into lawsuits. I think there's been 5 so far within the broad range of our accountability and enforcement oversight. And we've won 3, and 1 is pending, I believe. 1 was just dismissed. Those are now available on our webpage under, I think, legal action. So if you're interested, please visit our webpage.
Huntington Beach and Malibu are
I
2 of them.
wasn't going to say anything.
But you won't admit it to this group. She used to work for the city of Beverly Hills, so that's not it.
But I think that gives me an interesting perspective, right? So I'm working in a place that is totally different, and you know, it's, you know, I am happy to be back on the Central Coast and
Refreshing.
working at professionally at a place that really is taking the housing crisis seriously. But I think there were a lot of lessons learned in a politically difficult place, because that is not, I tell the planning team all the time, this is not how it is everywhere. Like, this is not how it is. You are so lucky that we can be proactive, and that the council is like thankful to staff when they say, hey, we proactively dealt with this barrier we found in the zoning code. I said, that is not how it is everywhere. So I think it's really important, one, for them to realize that, and two, you know, working in a place that's politically more challenging makes you figure out how to get things done in creative ways. So there's things professionally that I learned and that have helped me in places that, you know, the west side of Los Angeles is, tiny little projects will blow up into the biggest thing, but that I learned a ton from that. So.
One thing that was interesting to me and I didn't know about before is that this pro-housing designation, and I'm wondering, I don't think any of our local cities or county have a pro-housing designation. Could you just explain that a little bit? I think that would be an example of a carrot that the state has provided, and I'm just wondering your perspective on whether it was worth the effort and if it's had a benefit.
Absolutely. So the pro-housing designation, and please step in if I'm mischaracterizing anything, but you know, it is a carrot for cities who I think are really taking actions proactively and kind of beyond what the state requires at a minimum level to make changes, implement policies, carry out programs that are meant to really create the housing. And so this was something our council said, go figure out how to do this. Luckily, again, we had done most of the programs in our housing element that got us points. And, you know, it's an application, you get points for certain things, having certain types of zoning, programs. And so in terms of ease of getting this designation, a lot of the heavy lifting had already been done because of the housing element requirements. The actual application itself, I didn't actually have to do it, but I know there were a million calls between HCD and staff of like, okay, show us this ordinance, and what does this mean, and how do you interpret this? You know, but it ranges everything from, we lowered the requirement significantly for when something needs to go to planning commission. Things with 50 units and above go to planning commission, but otherwise, you know, they don't go to planning commission. We have loan deferral programs for fully affordable housing projects, so your impact fees are deferred for 20 or 30 years. And so we were able to take credit for a lot of those things. We got the designation. It makes us more competitive for certain grants and other programs. And then we also got, I think, $700,000 for being a pro-housing city that we are passing directly on to some of our local housing providers where there's some need for gap financing to produce, you know, we're really focused on the deed restricted units because that's what we're missing in our community from a RENA perspective and just from what we're hearing. So we're able to pass that money directly on. So I think I'd love to see more of the carrots. Carrots cost money, right? So, but it's been really, really great for us. So.
Great. So I'm going to ask one more series of questions and I'll open it up to Q&A for a bit. Lisa Engel that was going to be here. We did have a little bit of a Zoom session before this and looking to next year, the future. As an organization, we're sort of, you know, generally focused on workforce missing middle and had asked her, you know, what the focus in the legislature was going to be when it came to missing middle. And I'm probably simplifying her response, but the sense that I got was that the legislature has done or believes that they have done a lot when it comes to streamlining, allowing for development, and she sees that in the future, in the next couple of years, the legislature is going to spend most of its time focusing on homelessness and very low income. What do you see, or do you see that there's an emphasis at HCD or HAU where certain areas are either more heavily focused, prioritized, or funded, and do you see that changing, or what do you see the priorities being over the next year or two?
Well, so at HCD, it's hard to say. When we see new legislation come through, if there's something that may impact our department, we do often have the opportunity to say, hey, this will impact our workload as well, and we may or may not get extra staffing. So there's that. If I could just plug in the Surplus Lands Act in terms of middle income. So I work on the SLA team, that's publicly owned land, and I just want to say there's a lot of opportunity there for middle income, even though we also focus on 80% AMI or below. Above the 25% of units, beyond that, I think local jurisdictions, if they own the land, there is some potential there for moderate, above moderate market rate units. So if you have questions about your public lands, please see me, but we're also a data-driven unit, so depending on how your housing is looking, how many of the lower income to above moderate you're meeting, sometimes there's opportunities to see, okay, where's the need now? And we see that in the SLA when a local agency goes out and says, okay, here's our land, it's available. We want to see what affordable housing developers may propose on the land. That notice of availability, there is room. We would review that notice of availability if there was like a mixed use project that an agency had in mind, for example, and okay, as long as it meets certain criteria, then that's something that the agency could send out and receive proposals on, and we have seen that in the Central Coast. So,
and then for the city of SLO, what's going to over this next year, what's your focus or your priorities?
Yeah, so we are entering budget season, and we have a 2-year budget cycle, and so that's where all of our work program items come from. I imagine housing and homelessness will remain a major city goal, and so a lot of the work program items will tier off of that. We're finalizing some of our existing work program items. There was a big focus on missing middle, and so we are redoing 2 of our larger specific plan areas where there's 600 to 800 units of capacity, but we haven't seen a lot of action, and they're older specific plan areas that kind of prioritize larger lots with single family homes. So we're relooking at those to do more missing middle style, townhouse style, and so that's one thing we're focused on. We've recently changed our fee schedule to incentivize smaller units, and one of the things I'm more excited about, we haven't seen any takers yet, but we hopefully will, is in the downtown core, we did something called a flexible density. So any units under 600 square feet, I think, don't count toward your density limit. And so I imagine that in the next year, we might relook at that to see if there's something we can do to see if someone will do a project, that takes advantage of that. And we'll also just be hearing from the community about what are the things that they want to see, I think with a focus on missing middle and deed restricted units that can kickstart some of that development. So,
great. Yeah, I think one of the things you said when we spoke previously, and I think it kind of speaks about, it applies at all levels, right? The state is passing laws and it's an iterative process, right? They're constantly changing things because they have an ultimate goal that they're trying to meet. And similarly locally, right, trying to not get too invested into a policy or a zone or something that you've created, and be willing to look back at it the next year and see if it's achieving what you're wanting it to achieve, and making changes and trying to continue to adapt, and and working cooperatively with the HCD and HAU as much as possible, right, to try to all reach a collective goal. All right, I'm going to open it up for Q&A.
Hello, there we go. We're running a little bit behind, so we only have time for a couple questions. So I will sprint.
Thank you. This question is for Lisa. Say the County of San Luis Obispo got their housing element approved in 2020, but they haven't implemented any of the programs in the housing element. They're basically dust collectors. So 2 questions. 1, are they out of compliance? And 2, can we file builder's remedy projects now?
It's a legal question.
It's a very legal question. So I guess one thing I would say is, I mean, it could be, I'm not sure. I would look first to see if they received some sort of a compliance letter from HCD. We have a lot of those letters online under our accountability page. So you could just see where they're at. I'm assuming you may already know, I don't know, but yeah, some of the key ones are the rezones. There's other key programs and deadlines that cities and counties need to make, but we also have on our webpage whether the housing element is in or out of compliance. I had a slide maybe to show, but that's okay. So I would first go there.
And is builder's remedy only kicks in if they're out of compliance?
Right, once they're out of compliance. That is one of the biggest sticks out there is, once you're out of compliance with the housing element, certain things, either violation and fees or even builder's remedies.
And so if a local citizen was concerned or believes that they're out of compliance, is there a place where they can file a complaint or do something to at least know that somebody's investigating?
Right, so as mentioned earlier, we do have portals. You mentioned the portal. There's a number of portals. These are like areas where advocates, cities, counties, anyone with questions can go to and just submit those. So it would probably be on the accountability portal, which is available online, and you can just ask that directly.
I'd like to just put in a plug too for the dashboard on the HAU website, which has a ton of really interesting information. And you can filter it by county if you care what's happening here locally. Sorry, other questions? Barry, do you want to go over there? Thanks.
I'm just curious what ultimately makes or turns a city into a pro-growth versus a slow-growth city. What defines that? Is it the community? Is it the council members? And will that flip back and forth every time a new council's elected? Does the staff in any way contribute toward the notion of slow growth or no growth or pro-growth? What really defines that in a city?
Are you referring to the pro-housing designation or more?
No, I had the question just before that came up.
Okay.
So no, more in a general sense is what I'm curious about, because I've seen cities that seem to flip back and forth with the council, and it seems like it's really the council that drives that entire notion. But I'm wondering if my observation is true, or if there's a lot more to it.
I think at the core, yes. I mean, the council is the ultimate say, right? The council creates our major city goals. The council directs our work programs. The council allocates the budget, and I can't emphasize enough that, a budget is showing, you're putting your money where your mouth is. That is showing what your priorities are for what staff can and can't do. And so, and I think that gets to kind of what Shane was talking about is, when I talk to my staff, I'm like, this is this moment in time, but that could change, right? You get 3 new council members and they say, we've had enough. We want to go in this direction now. And, staff, we ultimately take direction from the city council, and we are allocated money for certain projects from the city council. That I think in some jurisdictions, staff has a little more sway with what happens internally, and in other jurisdictions, staff, is less advocates and more just carries out direction. But I think it absolutely starts with with council members and having that political will. And even informally, you know, I've talked to developers and they don't like risk, right? So even if the laws are all set up in a certain way, but they don't know if they're going to get past planning commission or council, they might not take the risk to do a certain project because it might be too risky to just see if they get a yes or a no. And so even informally, just at a project level, I think that can switch based on what's happening on your boards and your city council. I don't know if you have anything to...
I mean, I think there is a, like, one directional stickiness with like pro versus anti-housing or slow growth or whatever, where if you adopt policies that are pretty pro-housing, it's hard in part because of state laws to roll some of those things back. Like cities are prohibited from downzoning just flatly in most circumstances right now for at least 10 years. And so it's not that you can't roll back some of these things, but I think it's more kind of working around the margins, and you just can't completely undo things because, you know, the majority on council shifted immediately anyway. But of course, over time, those things can change. I think it's just, you can more quickly move in the pro-housing direction. And this is an observation of cities across the country that have gone like very pro-housing. So Spokane, Washington is one, Sacramento is another, Burlington, Vermont is another. These are cities that have essentially upzoned the entire city for missing middle, like 4plexes, 6plexes, or more. And what I've noticed is all of those cities have very strong, independent may not be the word, but let's just call it independent planning departments, where they are kind of allowed to take positions based on their expertise and ultimately recognize that at the end of the day, it is going to be a political decision made by the council members, and that is the way it should be. But they're also allowed to say, like, we think this is the right thing to do for these reasons based on our training and experience and so forth. And I think a lot of city staff, even at the highest level, are prohibited from doing that. They're not allowed. And it's very hard to make things happen in those kinds of places because I think it's just much more effective when you have the political side and the staff, the kind of expert agency side of things, pushing in the same direction.
And city managers and administrators matter too, obviously. I don't want to ignore that fact. Is, you know, a lot of times council members look to that person or director level people to say, well, what is happening out in the world, or what is best practice right now, or how do we do this thing? And so that relationship between electeds and upper management is really important. And, you know, you have some city managers that just have a goal and they're going to get there, and others that take more direction from the council. It just depends on the culture of the city agency.
Yeah. And then places like Los Angeles just don't have city managers.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Any more questions?
One last question, or all good? Okay. Thank you all very much.
Good job, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, that concludes our program. Again, if you feel inspired today and you want to take those flowers, please do so. Thank you guys so much for coming out, and we look forward to seeing you next year.